Welcome to the 22nd meeting of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off all their mobile phones and Blackberries, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. Agenda item 1 today is a decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 4 and 5 and the future considerations of evidence on its draft budget scrutiny in private? Are we agreed? Thank you. Agenda item 2 is draft budget scrutiny 2013 and 14. Second item on the agenda today is the evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft budget from the Minister for Environment and Climate Change. Very much welcome Paul Wheelhouse to his new role and to this visit to our committee here. He can introduce also his officials.
Thank you, Convener. To my left, I have Keith Connell, who's the Deputy Director of Natural Resources. I have Neil Ritchie immediately to my left, who's the Head of Natural Assets and Flooding, the Scottish Government, and Bob McIntosh, who is Director in respect of Environment and Forestry.
Thank you very much. And just before I continue, I'd like to welcome Nigel Don as a visiting member to the committee today as well. Going ahead then, we would invite you to make a brief introductory remarks with related to the budget and our focus on sustainable development.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to make some opening remarks. I will provide a brief overview of the budget plans for the environment and climate change side of the REE portfolio. In the context of the entire Scottish Government budget, our expenditure is relatively modest. Our emphasis is on protecting and improving Scotland's environment. And this work is not just about protecting our environment, but that of future generations. Climate change, adaptation and mitigation is a very good example. And with issues such as climate justice, we recognise our contribution and obligations to global society. Large parts of our work are more immediately recognisable, for example, in terms of water quality, biodiversity, woodland creation and flood risk management. To many, our contribution to economic growth is perhaps not immediately obvious, but it is an essential component of what we do. To many aspects of our economy, key sectors like food and drink and tourism, our quality environment is essential. This is not only for key inputs, but for supporting our iconic reputation in many international markets. A recent SNH commissioned report valued our environment as worth over $20 billion a year. We deliver much of this through our public bodies, such as the national parks. These are supported by my budget and work closely with businesses. Supporting businesses to flourish, but at the same time ensuring a due regard is given to the environment. I pay tribute to how SNH and SEPA have, under this government, worked to become more customer-focused, and SNH has been proactive in its engagement with planning regimes, supporting development and balancing due regard to the environment. It has worked closely with Forestry Commission Scotland as joint lead partner for the Central Scotland Green Network. SEPA is working closely with the government to implement a better environmental regulation programme of work. This is about focusing SEPA's resource where it has most impact and adds most value. We recently launched a consultation on the funding of SEPA's regulatory activities, and I mention this not because it's immediately relevant to the REE budget, but for the context of our engagement with business. It's about ensuring that SEPA's charging mechanism is fit for purpose and helps incentivise positive outcomes and behaviours. Our financial commitment to supporting SEPA's public good activity remains strong, and we are not changing SEPA's baseline from what was set out in the spending review. Too often we generalise about trade-offs between the economy and the environment, and these truly exist in specific cases, but what can be good for business can also be good for the environment and vice versa. The renewables sector is an area where we are managing these to mutual advantage. In addition, we are also leading the way in terms of promoting community benefits from renewables developments on the National Forest Estate. Our spend is also helping growth through its focus on preventative spending. Work on air quality will help reduce public health spend, as well as improving quality of life for individuals. On flood risk management, we are supporting implementation of the new approach set out in the 2009 Act. This work is a good example of the public service reform agenda in practice through its support to multi-agency and across geographic working. Success will support local economic development through confidence in protection for communities and businesses, and this should reduce the cost that flooding events can have. In conclusion, overall environmental and climate change expenditure supports both the economy and the environment and recognises the synergies between them. it must be seen in the wider context of action, for example, ensuring proportionate, fit-for-purpose regulatory frameworks such as the recently introduced Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Bill. We also need to ensure that we monitor our progress and, where needed, adjust our approach. The National Performance Framework is at the heart of this, but it is actively supported by our working on making the ecosystem services approach real, as well as SNH's important work on natural capital. And I hope this brief overview gives you an understanding of the activities we support and how they contribute to the Government's core purpose of sustainable economic growth.
Thank you, Minister. I would invite questions from members, and I believe that Graham Day is going to ask the first question.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I wonder, Minister, given your background in economics and having had a few weeks to settle into this role, can I ask, from which areas of the portfolio do you feel we're getting best and least return from spend in terms of generating sustainable economic growth? And can I also ask you to define what is meant by sustainable economic growth? Is it increasing employment or profitability, a mix of these, none of these? I think it would be useful to have that defined.
I think on the latter point, in terms of sustainable economic growth and in respect to the portfolio I represent, it's about ensuring that growth can take place both in terms of however it's measured. It could be measured in gross value added, it could be measured in other measures that are non-GDP related, but that there is economic growth, but it happens in a context where it's not damaging to the environment. So we manage the damage to the environment and hopefully enhance the environment in the process of sustaining economic growth. So, I mean, sustainable is a word that can mean many things to many different people, but in the context of the portfolio I represent, it's about enabling growth to take place in a way that doesn't damage the environment, and hopefully in the process we can fund activities that actually enhance the environment as well. So peatlands being a good example. And sorry, can you remind me, the first part?
The first part is looking at the spend. Where do you feel we're getting best and least return? Which areas?
Well, at the moment, it's to pick up on the peatlands example. There are many areas it's not possible to adequately define exactly what the contribution is to perhaps meeting, say, Scotland's climate change targets. However, we know that across a number of areas of activity, and this, I suppose, as an economist, it comes down to how you attribute the benefits of spend on environmental measures. So if you're improving biodiversity and there is a consequent increase in tourism activity, it's quite often hard to define what role the enhanced biodiversity and perhaps reintroduction of species such as seagulls has on generating new jobs, because there equally could have been an input in terms of marketing, there could have been change in exchange rate, fuel prices may have gone up or down and affected the numbers visiting a particular locality. So it's often very difficult in terms of hard economics to isolate and attribute the benefits that arise from an investment in something like a reintroduction of a species that's been lost to Scotland, and how that then impacts on economic value. But you know intrinsically it is a good thing, it is making a contribution, it's difficult therefore to allocate it. So a lot of the effort, I suppose, that needs to go into it is to try and work through market research, speaking to individuals who have visited an area to identify how important it was to their decision to come to an area. You can try and narrow it down in that way, but looking at the hard data, it's often difficult to isolate. But clearly we have a contribution across numbers of areas I outlined earlier in terms of spend directly on the natural environment, such as in forestry, which is producing productive forestry for construction sector, through to areas where we're more involved with regulation of the impact on the environment. So it's quite difficult to tell at what point that actually has an impact on economic value.
Mm-hmm. Just developing that point, if I may, and whilst appreciating the difficulty in measuring the impact of public spend on sustainable economic growth, it's suggested that there's an absence of systematic assessment ability across the portfolio. Do you think that's a valid criticism? And if so, how do you feel it could be addressed?
I think there's always some element of validity to a statement like that, because it's an evolving area of our knowledge. I think I don't want to keep harking on about peatlands, but peatlands being an area where we're still having to do work to identify. Well, I'm sure the convener will be happy with that. But we're still obviously working on trying to establish what the global scale of in a Scottish context, I mean, of the impact of measures in peatland can be. So there's still the evolving science. What we're trying to do is put the science resources in the right places so we can understand what these impacts are, and working closely with the academic community to identify that. There are areas where it's easier to measure, and I think possibly we are doing more anyway. I mean, looking at the Scottish People and Nature survey, that's a good measure which feeds into the National Performance Framework, which gives us the data about how many people are actually accessing the countryside and making use of our natural resources. You can then try and monetize that in terms of what the benefits are, measure benefits to health. But I do think we're still evolving our understanding of how the natural environment interacts with other portfolios, and how we can use an example of outdoor access and long-distance walks, which I know is an area that is very important from improving mental health, but also physical health. So as time goes on, we'll probably evolve more, and we need to work with other departments, and I acknowledge that. So I can give you an undertaking that where we can do, I will try and improve our understanding of these areas.
Okay, thank you.
Your words, if I may say so, from someone who's been involved with environmental issues like a lot of us here for many years and committed to sustainable development, are very encouraging. Could I just ask you, really on the back of what Graham Day was highlighting and your response, about the possibilities of alternatives or complements to GDP that would actually sort of focus Scotland and policymakers at all levels' minds, and hopefully involve communities more. If you know, we had a debate recently about that, which I think you were at, and whether you would see that in this context of this portfolio and in terms of environmental damage and inequalities, whether this would be a useful way forward, and whether Scottish Government might be able to look at this, taking into account how hard it is. I do appreciate that.
Yeah, well, certainly, I'm aware there are measures we're trying to improve understanding of the natural capital and sort of index, natural capital index, and there are alternatives to GDP. I mean, I think GDP is a useful measure in many ways, but it doesn't tell you the whole story, as you're quite right, in terms of the overall health in its broadest sense of your society and satisfaction among the society with the quality of life, quality of environment, and obviously there's a lot of silent stakeholders in this country, the wildlife and the natural environment, who don't have a say in many ways. We can't monitor what they think. So, you know, but we do have to, you know, take account of sustainability indicators, and I think that's something when I was on the Finance Committee that I was keen that we looked beyond just simple measures of GDP and harder economic indicators, and actually look at how we monitor and integrate sustainability into the national performance framework. And maybe I would ask if Bob McIntosh could speak about some natural capital index.
Yes, what's called the ecosystem services approach, it's a terrible name, is about trying to identify the goods and services we get from the natural world and put some sort of value on them. And that's quite a difficult thing to do, obviously, trying to value these intangible benefits. But as a famous economist once said, there may be no right way to put a value on a woodland or a peatland or a river, but the wrong way is certainly to give it no value at all in economic appraisals. So that's the approach we're trying to develop through the ecosystem services approach, trying to identify the goods and services, put some sort of value on them so that when financial appraisals are being carried out and development is being considered, that the value of the natural world and its services can somehow be built into that decision-making process.
If I may, convener, just add that in terms of the forest estate and its impact, that the non-market value ironically turns out to be greater than the market value of the forest. So the benefit to society from the point of view of promoting biodiversity through to the outdoor activities, the contribution to tourism development, mountain biking in the Borders, I'm sure very close to where you stay, Claudia, that there are good examples of where we're achieving great benefits, which are not necessarily the intended market value of the investment, but actually a greater positive impact on society through other activities.
Thank you.
Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Convener, and morning, Minister. You mentioned working with other departments earlier. What have you done to ensure that other committees are looking at climate change as part of their budget process?
I think, well, one thing we've done is, as you appreciate, as of yesterday, we've tried to make sure that the level 4 data is available for our own portfolio and to be open and transparent in response to requests from the Rural Affairs Committee and others for that information. I am undertaking a series of bilateral meetings with ministers, not done them all yet, but to try and identify where we can work together to ensure that whatever spend is being undertaken by each department, the ministers are aware of the options they have to them in terms of how potentially there might be other types of investment that could have an equal or greater impact, but might have other positive benefits in terms of maybe promoting biodiversity or having higher impact on our greenhouse gas emissions targets. So it's early days. Discussions on issues such as building regulations. Building regulations obviously have a key role in going forward in the RPP, and obviously will play a role in the RPP too, in terms of allowing us to fulfil our objectives on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's an area where we're going to have a number of different departments with, in terms of local government, housing and an environment portfolio working together to identify how we implement them, when we implement them, and how we can maximise the impact of them in terms of meeting the government's overarching climate change targets. So that's just one example, and I'm happy to keep the committee informed as we go forward as to any progress in that area, but that's hopefully helpful to you in terms of how the approach would develop. Similarly on transport, that's obviously a key area where there are concerns out in the wider community about the need to do more on transport. Clearly the government has made commitments in terms of supporting active travel, and most recently in the announcement by the Cabinet Secretary of additional money for cycling. But that's not to say that's sufficient. We know we have to go as far as we can, but across many areas of activity, I want to understand how we can influence individuals and businesses and public sector behaviours so that we can have not just government's effort working towards achieving the targets, but also how we can harness the impact of individuals and society as a whole to address those. So discussing with the colleagues how we can influence individuals' behaviours in their portfolios in interacting with housing or transport or other areas of the economy, that will also be helpful.
Well, can I just follow up on that? And how has that been welcomed by other departments?
Well, they all seem to welcome, I think, the involvement with the agenda. I mean, it'd be true to say that everyone is aware, because of obviously the first set of targets, that this is an extremely important issue for the government and for the Parliament as a whole. We have a green Parliament, I believe, in the context of parliaments around the world. We know there's great interest in the Parliament that we achieve our mutually unanimously agreed Climate Change Act and the targets, and I think there's widespread recognition within the government that this is something that we simply have to do. It's a given that this is something we have to do. So I think they're welcoming the engagement, and where I would like to think we can help them is in providing the expertise that I have not only here but in the wider portfolio on a technical front to help them understand how the spend they are undertaking does interact with the environment, and how we can perhaps fine-tune to improve our performance. So I hope that will be seen as a positive contribution to their policy development, as well as potentially helping the government's overall strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Body Beamish on that point, and then Jim Hugh.
Thank you, Convener. Just to follow on and go a bit further on that point in relation to the report on policy and proposals and how that might fit with the missed emissions which came up yesterday. Would you agree that while it's very difficult to look at, for instance, in transport, the modal shift and changing from, and you've mentioned behaviour, attitudes, Minister, already, but changing from one mode to another in transport, or having more money put into energy efficiency in order not to have fuel poverty, or whatever the issue is, that is a very difficult change. It's partly a culture change. But in addition to those behavioural changes which Scottish Government can support, would you agree that we will need to accelerate the pace of commitment to those areas and to land use strategy in order to to meet the targets in the longer term?
Well, I mean, Claudia Beamish is quite correct, Convener, that, that there certainly is a need for, in terms of the RPP, we know that we will only achieve our targets on climate change if we implement the policies and obviously implement as many of the proposals that are set out as possible. And we need buy-in both from the community but also from government agencies, local authorities, COSLA, others out there in society. So I think it is imperative that we try and do as much as we possibly can, and it doesn't just, as I said in my statement yesterday, it doesn't just come down to government. We need everybody to buy into that. I do agree where we can accelerate. I will try and push for that. But we do, as I said yesterday, operate in particularly constrained times. I guess what I would hope that is, if there are additional resources that ever become available, that we will. You know, I will be doing my best to ensure that they are prioritised towards achieving our environmental and climate change objectives. Other portfolios will obviously be fighting their own corner, but I would hope that we can find through bilaterals, we can find ways where we can agree that if money is available, that there are ways in which we can actually achieve both objectives, and that's where the dialogue will come about. So if we can influence, say, transport policy, and through providing more information that fine-tunes and helps our understanding of the climate change impacts and maybe improves our base knowledge of which forms of transport are having the greatest impact, and that may well then feed into changes in policy. But it's not my portfolio, so I can't determine changes in transport. It just, all we'll do is act as an advisory capacity to ensure that they have the information that's available to them to make the right choices, I hope, for the environment.
Thank you.
Minister's portfolio, Jim Hume. Good morning, Minister. And you mentioned RPP, RPP2 and climate change targets. Do you believe that the current budget is sufficient to meet the climate change targets for under RPP1? And how will you ensure that those future targets can be met? And regarding RPP2, do you foresee that having more detail so that it would be more easily scrutinised by ourselves and stakeholders?
RPP2 is obviously still under development, and you know, as I said yesterday, we are planning for that to be this calendar year. It does need to be a robust document, and therefore, you know, I think it's important that we get the balance right. Certainly, in terms of the funding that we currently have, if you're asking me a question, in an ideal world, would we have more money to be able to target towards reducing our climate change impact? Then absolutely, I think I would be surprised if anyone in the Parliament disagreed with that. The challenge we face, obviously, is that we don't live in unconstrained times, and what I think we can do is work across portfolio in the way I was outlining to Claudia Beamish and to Margaret McDougall, to ensure that where we have spend being delivered by government, we obviously have a big government budget overall. I said earlier on that our portfolio spend is relatively modest, but there are many activities that are being delivered across portfolios, whether it's flooding management spend through local government, through to a transport portfolio, as we were discussing earlier, where the government does have considerable influence. And what I believe the government is doing is trying to prioritise increasing the amount of spend to those areas which have the highest impact. We need to fine-tune our understanding, to pick up on the earlier points that Graham Day raised regarding our understanding of what actually does make a difference. And hopefully over time, even if we haven't got the same amount of money, we can spend it in such a way as it has at least as big an impact, potentially bigger impact. There are some areas where you get diminishing returns to your investment. For example, in housing, we know that they're putting in basic insulation measures, and you know, things like double glazing can have a huge impact on the energy efficiency of a house. There are desirable things to do as you approach, you know, Sullivan standards and beyond, to sort of passive house standard, which perhaps have a more marginal or less marginal impact as you go, so the marginal sort of impact of the spend decreases. So I think we can build our understanding as time goes on, and fine-tune to make best use of the resources we do have. Hopefully in future we'll have more money available to us, and we're looking to ways in which we can involve private sector, try and lever in more money across a number of areas to try and support and enhance the amount of spend the government itself has at its availability. And obviously, when you come to consumers, consumers can themselves exercise decisions that have an impact on reducing their climate change impact. So if we can, going back to the behavioural point, ensure that consumers are doing the right thing, then that supports and adds to what the government is already doing with its own spend.
Just to push one of the points that I don't think was quite picked up, and just to... No, not at all. No, I'll just be quite direct. Do you think the existing budget, as it stands, is sufficiently funded for you to meet the targets that are already there?
So I remain confident that we're on the right trajectory to meet the climate change targets. As set out in my statement yesterday, I do believe that if we are able to successfully implement the policies we put in and indeed obviously work up and develop the proposals that were in the RPP, then we will be in a good place in terms of the trajectory that I set out yesterday. We are reliant on some external decisions, such as we're pushing with the UK government for a 30% target for climate change gas reductions at European level, and we hope that that will prevail. That is important in terms of the overall impact of RPP, as I'm sure you're aware. But within our own portfolio, I'm confident we are doing the right things. We are making great progress on forestry in terms of meeting our 10,000 hectare per annum targets. We believe we're in a very good place to meet that target in the current year. So I suppose I'm trying to give you some assurance. I think we are on the right trajectory. Yes, ideally, if we had more money, we could achieve things faster, but I think we're on the right path.
Thanks.
I wonder if the Minister could reflect on the possibility of the sale of allowances under the EU ETS scheme, because we understand in phase 3 that at least 50% of the allowances and 15% of aviation allowances will be auctioned. And that the go-ahead for this may well occur towards the end of this year. Subject to EU approval, it's expected these allowances will be auctioned in November and December. And the UK can expect to auction approximately 7 million aviation allowances as well. I wonder if the Minister could go away and find out for us if there's any knock-on income for us in Scotland through the Barnett formula, because I believe that the monies for these in the past have gone into the consolidated fund.
As Convener may expect, I'll be delighted to explore that issue with our UK government colleagues. But certainly, yeah, you raised an important point. I think obviously the ETS has an important role to play in itself in terms of achieving the climate change targets. But if there are revenues arising from it, then that's something clearly we would want to establish if there are consequentials for our own budget. So I'm happy to come back to the committee with
to hear about
some information on that.
And I think it's very pertinent in this budget round that we know where we could get any extra pennies or two.
Indeed.
Thank you. Jim, did you have another question?
Not on that point.
Okay, I'm sure you'll come back. Claudia Beamish, next.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted Minister to focus on the equalities issue with you and other committee members who want to take that forward. I was very encouraged to see the SNH budget submission that highlighted the importance of working with a range of groups. And in their submission, they say, we support local communities with the aim of helping to address Scottish Government priorities of tackling the big problems that Scotland faces, particularly poor health, deprivation, slow economic growth, and the lack of good intervention in early years. While I might somewhat disagree with the issue around economic growth and hope to see it written as sustainable development, that's perhaps a bit of a quibble. But in the sense of the equality statement, which, as you will know, says that ministers and relevant officials were informed of the potential impact of equality of the 9 characteristics in developing spending proposals at the relevant stages of the budget process. And could you highlight for this committee what advice was given regarding the parts of the budget for which you have responsibility, and if there was any action taken as a result of this advice?
Certainly. First of all, I can sort of give an example where I think our work is supporting sort of equality's agenda, and then I'll go on to the point you raised about what we've actually done. I think the Central Scotland Green Network, which I'm not sure if Claudia Beamish was at the presentation that was given in Parliament recently, but that's an example of where we're, through government spend, influencing the amount of forestry and improving the outdoor environment around urban areas. And I think, as I said earlier on, I think that has an impact on the ability to support mental health and physical health improvements within local communities. In many cases, these communities are in sort of post-industrial communities in the central belts, perhaps helping disproportionately those on lower incomes in terms of the distribution of income to the population. So I think it's a good example of where a government, while achieving our targets for on an environmental side in terms of tree planting and its impact on climate change, we're actually having a byproduct of supporting a greater equality of spend in terms of improving the physical environment for people perhaps in lower income groups. In terms of our involvement in the process, clearly much of the work around the budget, this year's budget, was taken before I was appointed. But I did ask about this issue with colleagues, and ministerial colleagues and officials were involved in this work to ensure that a wide range of potential implications from our budget decisions on equality and also carbon were understood. And the equality statement, we believe, provides a very helpful way of articulating potential impacts to support scrutiny of the budget process and the decisions that we've taken. It was even more important that these factors were reflected in the government's thinking before budget decisions were taken. And I think my own involvement in the SPPA committee, we were very conscious of the role of the Equalities Commission, committee, and the desire to see equalities issues mainstreamed through all portfolios. So I'm certainly very happy to take any suggestions from the Rural Affairs Committee about how you think that can be better implemented within the portfolio going forward. And I've given undertaking to Claudia Beamish to certainly take any points on board. I know I have her interest in that area.
Thank you, Convener. That's very helpful. Thank you, Minister. And I mean, what might be helpful is if perhaps it would be possible to identify ways in which within the portfolio that we're looking at, particularly in relation to some of the, or not to, I'm only really singling out 2 or 3 of the protected characteristics, but for instance, in relation to age and older people, possibly in relation to outdoor activities or how ethnic minority groups are involved or disabled groups. I'm not only talking about outdoor activities, although I take the point you've made about the Central Scotland Green.
Yes, I appreciate there's a number of different facets of equalities and agenda, and I'm happy to ensure, I mean, we are looking, for example, in the context of the Climate Challenge Fund, there are a number of communities, and indeed communities within communities that we're aware that might not be benefiting from the Climate Challenge Fund. We've looked at the socio-economic profile of those communities that have drawn in funding. It's likely to have impact in terms of age as well, and also the ethnic diversity of those communities that have applied for funding. So where we can do, we're trying to ensure that that we make a greater impact in terms of allowing communities that have missed out on areas of funding such as that to take advantage of it. And indeed, obviously, we hope to come forward soon with information about the Junior Climate Challenge Fund as well, to look at the age of people who are involved and try and ensure that as many young people are involved with projects of that nature as we possibly can. So that's just one sort of practical example of where we're trying to target a specific cohort of people within society and ensure that they are benefiting from the spend that we do have at our disposal.
Alex Ferguson.
Thank you, Convener. Just a very brief supplementary to that. The Minister's mentioned the Climate Change Fund in relation to communities, and one of the specific questions that we asked people in our call for written evidence was, could climate change grant schemes to communities do more to encourage sustainable economic growth? And in what I thought was a very interesting answer from the Comrie Development Trust, which I think a lot of people look upon as a sort of shining star of how development trust should operate, I thought they gave us a very interesting answer, which said we have concerns about how communities can develop sustainable projects when they aren't allowed through CCF to generate an income. And they make a very pertinent point, which is climate change is a long-term problem but can't be tackled by short-term funding. And I just wondered if you could comment on that general issue, i.e. really the lack of an ability to create an income, which I think is sustainable, is economic growth when you're trying to achieve sustainable growth.
You're absolutely right, Mr Ferguson, that certainly in terms of sustainability in the true sense of the word, yes, from a financial sustainability point of view, if you want these behaviours to be ingrained into and the changes that you've effected through Climate Challenge Fund to have a longer term impact, then certainly that's one area that we are looking at in terms of the Climate Challenge Fund. And there currently is a bar, as I'm sure you're aware, that prevents CCF projects generating an income from their activity, and this was put in place when the fund was launched. It is a potential barrier to sustainable funding of some CCF groups and does preclude CCF from supporting some innovative and enterprising ideas. But in view of that, when CCF funding was reconfirmed in the current spending round, a new strand of activity on revenue raising was explored to see how projects might over time become self-financing, alongside a commitment to increase the involvement and opportunity fund to young people, as I mentioned to Claudia Beamish, in terms of a junior strand or the JCCF. So it's something we're certainly looking at to see whether there are, allowing for issues such as state aid and other factors, whether there are opportunities for us to allow groups to retain some income and obviously become self-financing to support the retention of those activities in longer term. And hopefully that will benefit the likes of Comrie, and I'm sure Annabel Ewing will have an interest in that as well. But it's clearly an area that yes, if we can make some movement on that, I'm happy to look at it.
Grateful for that.
Indeed, and Dick Lyle wishes to
so I just very
this as well.
Thank you, Convener. I just wish to, at this point, to remind the committee of my declaration when I first became a member of this committee. I didn't actually have any role to play in the formulation of the Commonwealth Development Trust's mission this morning. That's important to mention. One substantive point in general to do with CCF and this issue, state aid. I mean, obviously that is a potential issue, but you know, there are de minimis rules, and I would have thought, particularly in this kind of activity, the de minimis rules would be of great help, perhaps, potentially.
Yeah, anyway. I absolutely take that point on board, and I don't know whether, I'm just trying to think, would it be Bob that would be able to answer that point?
Yeah, I think you're right. In terms of the de minimis rules, there's probably quite a lot can be done in this area before we hit any barriers in that sense.
Dick Lyle, want to follow up any of these points?
No, I think the question I was going to ask actually was posed by Alec and Ferguson. I'm quite happy to go on to something else if that's possible.
Yes, sure. Yeah. Why not?
Earlier, in the early evidence sessions on carbon assessment of the budget, they said there would need to be a need in future years to expand on the work undertaken in the carbon assessment, particularly to ensure downstream emissions are included. How would you take that agenda forward to ensure that the carbon assessment can be improved on?
I have to apologise to Mr Lyle that I'm not yet, given I'm early into this role, as familiar with that as I would like to be. I know, to give an example, I mentioned it earlier on in terms of peatland being a classic example, I suppose, of where we're still at an evolutionary stage in terms of our understanding of the impact of emissions in terms of spend. And that's a clear example where we know intrinsically it would be a good thing to re-wet peatlands and to allow peatlands to expand to back to where they normally are in terms of the coverage in Scotland. There's about 20% of the land mass, as I understand it, is currently peatland, but it would have a potentially enormous impact on our ability to meet our climate change targets. We just do not know at this stage yet, but we're getting there, exactly how much we might be able to save in terms of CO2 emissions. But maybe if I could ask colleagues to, yourself, Bob, Convener, could I invite Bob McIntosh to address that issue, please?
Yes, so not much I can add. I think it's not really my area either. But yes, I mean, one of the big difficulties we have is in assessing the carbon implications of many of the activities and policies that are around, and that's a bit of a barrier to fully working out the downstream implications. But there is a lot of work going on at the scientific level to try and better understand the implications. And in the meantime, we're just having to make the best of what information is to hand.
Claudia Beamish?
I mean, sorry.
Let me add, clearly we're not doing this in isolation. There's obviously UK agencies, UK research, and indeed European and international research, and where we can learn from research that's being conducted elsewhere, not just using our own research budget, but peer research elsewhere across the global community, because there is obviously a lot of attention on these issues internationally. We will certainly do so, so I just wanted to make that point.
Indeed, the way the IUCN is working, that Scotland will be a centre of excellence for this information, so you know we are working in a worldwide scale on this. A brief supplementary,
Right, yeah.
we've got
Thank
quite
you,
a lot
Convener.
of other questions on the budget.
Yeah, I do appreciate that, Convener. Thank you. It was really just, Minister, in relation to the downstream issue that I think it is very complex, and actually I understood it quite recently myself as well. But in terms of, say, the transport issue, as I understand it at the moment, the budget would take into account the carbon assessment, in the carbon assessment tool, what it is that it's cost to actually build the road, but not the subsequent road use. And taking into account the points you were making earlier about the complexities about assessing those, and we don't have the time in this committee to go into that today, but I think there have been requests, and I would be interested to know whether the Scottish Government might be able to take into account looking in the carbon assessment tool at those downstream issues in transport and other areas in the future.
Certainly happy to give that undertaking to Claudia Beamish. It's one of the things in terms of the bilaterals that I think, in the case of transport, there probably will be, you know, sort of ongoing discussion about that. I'm aware in my former life of being in the Finance Committee, representation made by Transform Scotland and others about the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance process and how projects were assessed. So it's something that I will always be open to information on that front, and if we can help colleagues in other departments, not just transport but other departments, fine-tune their own appraisal processes so that we can better understand downstream impacts, and that certainly be something I'm happy to do.
Thank you.
Jim Hume,
Yes.
question 3, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just, thank you, Convener. It was just regarding outcomes and how we measure that. I mean, we can all say, you know, any of us could say we spend X thousand on Y and B thousand on A, etc., etc. But I would be more interested in how you think we should measure if that's been successfully spent in the future. What sort of ways would you measure that outcomes?
Absolutely. I think across, I mean, something I'm sure you'll address to the Cabinet Secretary when he comes next week as well, but across the portfolio, we are trying to understand a sort of vision, if you like, of where we would like to see Scotland and its rural communities and the rural environment sort of 5, 10, 15, longer term basis as well. And I think if you're looking at it from the point of view of sort of outcomes in terms of sustainable economic growth, if I'm narrowing it down to that level, you know, what we'd like to see, I suppose, is that to an extent we can kind of close the growth gap between rural and urban Scotland, but in a way that's sustainable in an environmental context. So that would maybe possibly enabling, you know, whether you're looking at sort of we've obviously got land reform, which is under my stewardship. Land reform can help to support and sustain you know, appropriate land uses in small rural communities that will help sustain their economic growth, through to you know, crofting. Crofting is obviously a key sector within particularly in the West Highlands and Islands of Scotland and Argyll. So it's somewhere that will be able to sustain economic growth, but hopefully we can manage that in a way that is environmentally sustainable as well. But we need to be looking at outcomes and measures which monitor the vibrancy of rural communities, the health of our rural environment and our urban environment, both in terms of things like air quality and so forth as well. So across a number of fields, we I suppose have to have an idea of where we're going, where we want to be ideally. Some of it may not be attainable in terms of that we just simply don't have the spending power at our disposal, or we have to make choices about how we prioritise our spending, as you self mentioned. But I would like to think that we can support sustainable growth across key sectors such as agriculture, tourism, but where we have national targets for growth, but in a way that people at the end of the process say, we managed that, but we managed it in a way which didn't detract from our environment. The agriculture and fisheries bill obviously is one way we're trying to do that with a specific sector, but there are other sectors where we'll have to do something similar in terms of managing their impact on the environment, both in terms of energy and tourism.
Okay. Just if I can follow that up, you mentioned you're going to look at ways of measuring outcomes and measures. What sort of timeline are we looking at that for that? Will that be with come in with RPP, or would that be something?
Well, I think these are there's kind of two strands. But you've got RPP2, which will obviously set out how the government believes Parliament and government can achieve our climate change targets over that period up to 2027. 2023 to 2027, so extending the life, if you like, of the measures announced in the RPP itself. But in terms of looking at other measures, we have national performance framework and obviously at local level, single outcome agreements which feed into that. So those are different time horizons, I suppose, and but hopefully they will not be disconnected, that they will kind of feed into each other, and you know, where obviously if there are areas where we can improve that, then I will be happy to look into it. But there are two separate strands, I suppose, which hopefully speak to each other. They're not totally isolated from each other, but that you have to have an understanding of where you're going in the short, medium, and indeed long term. And I think on issues such as the environment, it's a classic case where we're not just looking at 2 or 3 year time horizons, we're looking at much longer time horizons because of the scale of the challenge. And obviously we have as a government a target for 80% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So that's a very stretching target, but we need to start thinking longer term in terms of how we achieve that in terms of our policies.
That's okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. Margaret McDougall, please.
Thank you, Convener. A number of witnesses expressed their concerns that the government is not doing enough to meet our carbon emission targets. In particular, they suggested we could do more to achieve a win-win situation, meeting our carbon emissions targets while also generating more economic growth and addressing issues like flooding. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I do agree. I mean, I've had some early discussions with stakeholders on these sorts of issues, and you mentioned flooding. That's perhaps a very good example, if I may say so, where perhaps we can look at sort of catchment management approach to flooding. And so obviously we have a choice as a society as whether we want to spend a lot of money on very costly, sometimes quite obtrusive flood mitigation measures downstream in an urban setting, maybe in a town, to prevent flooding in a town, or can we take very much a more kind of natural flood management approach, looking at reintroducing meanders to rivers, planting forestry in an upland part of the catchment to try and slow the rate at which water feeds its way into the water courses. There's lots of things we can do. The natural, our biodiversity strategy can actually support in some respects. We've obviously got an ongoing trial in terms of in Knapdale with the beaver trial, and the beaver may in some areas be an appropriate solution to introducing naturally flood management measures, not necessarily widely welcomed by the farming community, it has to be said. But it's an example where we have to manage the interests of those who are producing our food, our vital food, but at the same time trying to take account of perhaps areas where there can be spin-offs, positive spin-offs for both farmers and wider community of reintroductions of species. So, we can use the natural environment. You're absolutely right. We can use the natural environment in a way such as we're supporting our environmental objectives, which has this win-win effect that you've got a positive impact, in this case, downstream on reducing the flood risk to communities and perhaps valuable farmland as well. I hope that's maybe an example where I support that approach.
Thank you for that. Returning to the Crofting Commission and its budget, we're talking about a cut next year. Well, we'll deal with the Crofting first, I think. Yeah. Sorry. We're talking about a reduction of about 1.5 million expected as income from the sale of surplus land. How confident are you that the market is such that we'll be able to get 1.5 million?
It's obviously a challenging market for all property investment and sales. The view we've taken is we do expect to sell the stud farm. So we are reasonably confident that we'll obtain the income that we have identified, which just sort of to stress there isn't a cut in a sense to the budget. It's merely it's the way the data are presented. Obviously, it's shown net of the receipt from the stud farm. it's you know, I guess ultimately if the sale were to not happen, we would have to find resource from elsewhere. We'd have to look at generating income from elsewhere, or indeed using you know, contingencies for that. But we're pretty confident that we can sell the farm. It's difficult to say exactly what value you receive, obviously, in a market which is reasonably volatile at the moment.
Yeah, okay, but I think you've said enough in the answer for us to be going on from that. But to go back to another supplementary point that Angus MacDonald was going to ask just on the previous subject. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Convener. Just picking up on Margaret McDougall's point, and given that flooding has been mentioned, I note from the level 4 figures that there is funding for flood and coast protection to the tune of about 4 million plus between the period 2012 to 2014. Now, if members will forgive me for being parochial, although I'm not really being parochial, there is clearly an issue with Grangemouth being of strategic national importance to the economy, given that we have the petrochemical plant on site. Now, that petrochemical plant brings in £3.6 billion to the GDP per annum. However, flood defences are required to protect the site in the future. Can I ask the Minister, and take this opportunity to do that, if he is liaising with other departments with regard to possible future capital funding for flood defences in the Grangemouth area?
I may, Convener, just bring Neil Ritchie in on this in a minute, but if I can firstly just sort of say that you're right to identify there's a relatively modest amount in the portfolio itself in terms of flood management and coastal erosion funding, but that is very much the tip of the iceberg of funding that the government is itself spending on flood management issues. Most of the budget is obviously through local government funding stream, and indeed, you know, there's a very substantial budget, I believe in the order of about 40 million that's spent on flood management, which is assumed within the local government budget. It's obviously through the Concord Act, that is money that is no longer ring-fenced, and we know local government colleagues will be, in local authorities across Scotland, will be prioritising their own projects, maybe using their own capital budget as well to supplement that in some cases. But if I can maybe bring Neil Ritchie in, if I may, Convener, just on the issue about Grangemouth specifically.
Yeah, just add to the Minister's point about the funding. We came up with a special arrangement in this spending review to allocate the 42 million a year that's identified within local authority settlement for flood protection schemes, working with COSLA, representatives of local authorities, to actually allocate them the money to projects that were of the most value. We're currently having discussions with COSLA around actually future spending review arrangements, given that there will be a very significant change in arrangements once the flood risk planning districts are up and running, and we have the local flood risk strategies. So that's just a general point, but that does highlight the issue about national importance will be one of the factors that are in there. There's currently, as Mr MacDonald will be aware, as I think is a member, a Russell Griggs-led group looking at a number of issues around the Grangemouth area and supporting economic development there. My team is involved in that group. We had at the last meeting a presentation identifying the latest assessment of flood risk, which was in the area following some work Falkirk Council has done, which is has showed a much nicer map than was previously the case through new data that's come along. We have been supportive of the bid that Falkirk Council has made for tax incremental financing pilot, which is currently being worked up, some of which funding is to be supporting flood protection work in the area. So overall, we are working very closely with colleagues across the office and in Falkirk Council and elsewhere to support the work in Grangemouth and support economic development and help manage the flood risk.
Convener, thank you. I'm heartened by that feedback. I would just like to place on record that Falkirk Council have estimated the cost between 40 million and 100 million, so it's clearly an issue of a significant importance. Thank you.
Okay, and Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. And to go back to sort of the generalities of the flooding issue, which the Minister referred to. I mean, of course, one of the issues in the mix is the accumulation of gravel on rivers, and what I would ask the Minister, if possible, to do would be to go away and have a look at the SEPA guidance. And my feeling is that farmers simply don't really have any confidence in seeking to take action or not, because they're not entirely sure what the repercussions might be, and they really are very risk averse to getting involved in any repercussions, and quite rightly so. So I feel that that's an area where there could be greater movement, but something needs to happen in terms of the guidance being a bit clearer, perhaps. And if the Minister could look at that.
I'm happy to inform the committee that SEPA are currently reviewing that guidance as we speak. So, but we will obviously make sure that the committee are aware of the outcome of that.
Thank you.
And we'll feed your comments into SEPA.
Thank you for that. Can we move on to Alec Ferguson? A question, please.
Thank you, Convener. I want to move on to the subject of forestry, if I may, Minister. Briefly, and you mentioned earlier that you felt that the government was making great progress in forestry, and that's obviously good to hear. We did hear recently in evidence, particularly from CONFOR representatives, that the forestry sector, and I don't think anybody would argue with this, has got a great contribution to make to sustainable economic development. But one of the things we heard was that, particularly from the private sector, is they feel the balance between the planting of commercial woodland and non-commercial woodland is perhaps a little bit too much in favour of non-commercial woodland, and that a greater benefit would be felt if more commercial woodland could be planted. In order to do that, they also felt quite strongly that the budget would need to be increased if they were to meet the targets that were being asked of them. And indeed, the representative told us that if there is no funding other than the existing level of provision in the current budget, nearly all of that would be taken up with legacy payments or commitments that have already been made. And I just wondered whether the Minister could comment on that in terms of future planting requirements.
Sure, I'm happy to, Convener. Mr Ferguson is quite right to raise the point about the balance, and we do recognise that perhaps in the past the balance has not been correct, that has an implication for the supply of timber for the timber processing sector and also for construction, other areas. That there has been a concern expressed by CONFOR and others about the balance in terms of productive forestry versus non-productive planting. What we can say, I mean, the spending plans already do contain a provision for £33 million per year for woodland creation, and I can reassure, I hope, Mr Ferguson and others in the committee that from what we're observing, there has been a growth in both productive forestry, through obviously conifers being the main component, and broadleaf forestry in the current year, and so that's quite encouraging at both. But we still were prepared to look at where necessary to try and improve the balance. We cannot obviously dictate to landowners what they plant in terms of when they're given grants, but we can influence, hopefully to a degree, the nature of those. We are aware that there are obviously broadleaf species which are useful for productive forestry as well. So it's not simply the case that it was only conifers versus broadleaves, and there are indeed conifers which contribute to our biodiversity and are productive, such as Scots pine, which is obviously a restoration of a native species, but can also be a very useful product for the commercial forestry industry. I mean, I'm happy to take on board the points he raises, but I just wondered whether it might be an issue. Bob, if you want to comment further. Sorry, Convener, through the Convener.
Maybe worth just saying on the funding front that this is probably the first year for quite a few years when the budget will actually be spent. I mean, it's been underspent in previous years because the demand hasn't been there. That's building up now, and we expect to spend the full budget this year. As the Minister said, we're rather in the hands of landowners as to whether they put forward commercial schemes or native woodland schemes. We can influence their decision-making through the level of grants, but total funding has not been an issue now. As we move into the next rural development programme and the next funding through the whole European funding for rural development, then we'll need to look carefully at how we position the grants in the next rural development programme and how we slant them towards achieving the objectives we want to have.
Could I just follow up that very briefly, Convener? I absolutely hear what's being said, but my assumption is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the reasons that the funding has not been fully taken up in past years is that it's taken a while to catch up from the complete lack of funding from 2006 onwards, which there was for a couple of years. Forestry schemes take a long time to implement, and I'm sorry if that sounds like preaching, but everybody knows that is the case. Just on the subject of the budget, I mean, again, we were told in this committee that there's a potential demand for some 45 million next year against the budget requirement, against the budget level of 33 million. Although I think we were told it was 36, but I think the minister's just said 33, but we'll not argue about 3 million here and there. But I just, there seems to be a little bit of a contrast there in positions, and I just wonder what the minister could say about that to reassure us.
If I may defer, convener, to Bob McIntosh, I think he'll give you a more expert answer on this point than I will.
Well, clearly budgets are not limitless. There is a significant budget for woodland creation. That should be enough to deliver the 10,000 hectares that we're looking for. We may have over-demand on that budget next year, but then, you know, as I say, the 10,000 is the target rather than, you know, it has to be done within the budget that's available. We think it can be. If there's more demand next year, we'll have to carry forward some of that demand into the following year, I guess, is the only way we can handle it.
Just very, very finally, I'm sorry, just on one point, 10,000 is the target, absolutely, and I think it's currently around about 7, is that correct?
More than 9,000 in the last year, but we're hopeful to achieve 10,000 target next year. Is that correct?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, just about reference to the achieving that target. In terms of increasing non-commercial tree planting in Scotland, we've had a one-off substantial boost this year, I think, from the Woodland Trust Diamond Jubilee Forest Scheme. Minister, I think you'll also be aware of the schemes run by the Trust and the Forestry Commission to lease parcels of land from the MOD and local authorities for planting native species. I'm just wondering how much importance you attach to such contributions and whether you're actively encouraging local authorities to participate in these schemes.
I think any effort that can be made to add to what, as I said in my ministerial statement yesterday, that the government can only do so much. If we can enlist the support of whether it's charities such as Woodland Trust or indeed other public agencies like MOD, and obviously we're doing it within our own sphere within Forestry Commissions and the National Forest Estate, if we can enlist as much support as possible to achieve these targets, that is absolutely something that's desirable to achieve. So where we can do, I would absolutely support that. And if indeed the committee can identify examples where they think we can do more of that, then I'd be glad to hear them. I certainly welcome and I'd be glad to add my support to what Woodland Trust are doing and indeed other charities to support the effort of government, because it's too big a challenge to be left purely to government. As I said earlier on, we need communities, individuals, businesses, other agencies to all you know, put their shoulders to the wheel and help us achieve these targets, because it is absolutely crucial for us all.
Thanks.
Just on a technical point, Minister, at the beginning of this month I was at the opening of the Coolag Woodlands Tree Nursery in Little Ascent in west of Sutherland. And I was discussing with them about the planting in that area. And it's a technical point. When we talk about commercial planting, are we talking about clear felling approaches, and that native woodlands are more a case of managing them tree by tree or small blocks of trees at best? Is there a way of bringing together a different process than just the clear felling approach that commercial forestry has used? And indeed, my point to the people at Little Ascent was, how are you going to be prepared to explain how the timber you're growing can be harvested commercially?
And indeed, I think we've obviously put a lot of effort into agriculture as opposed to forestry in terms of trying to help farmers understand how they can, through changes in farming practices, help support us in terms of environmental issues, whether it's reducing diffuse pollution to protecting biodiversity. You know, obviously things like corn creeks and other species are being supported by farming. So equally in terms of forestry, I think there's a case for perhaps enhancing our understanding of how forestry practices impact on whether it's flood management issues, but if you're obviously ploughing furrows downhill in a very much an area where there's a high risk of flood management, that's not going to help in terms of the runoff from the upper parts of the catchment. So if there are lessons that can be learned, and absolutely I think that's important we do that, and we kind of try and learn from best practice where it does occur, where people are taking mitigation measures to where it's possible to do so. It's not always possible to change practice, but I would hope that where people can do so, they will think about the environmental considerations. And I just wonder if I can maybe ask Bob McIntosh to explain what Forestry Commission Scotland are doing on their own estate to address those issues.
There's quite a lot of work going on to encourage what's being called low-impact forest management, which is moving towards smaller-scale fellings while trying to maintain the productivity of forests. But it's a form of forest management which relies very much on having stable soils and a reasonable climate. And parts of Scotland where our woodlands sit are not always blessed in that way. So in windy conditions and very wet soils, it's quite difficult to manage forests in that low-impact continuous cover system, and therefore some sort of clear felling system is likely to be needed to continue in some of the productive woodlands in the uplands, but perhaps on a smaller scale than we're seeing now.
Thank you for that. Turning to National Park Authority's evidence, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. We had a very interesting contribution in the oral evidence from the representative of the Lomond and Trossachs National Park. And of course, the national parks have a specific obligation to balance economic growth with environmental sustainability. So they're actually having to deal with these issues day and daily as part of their job. And what he suggested as two possible ways to proceed would be to focus more on having public spend leverage in private sector benefits. So he gave the example of infrastructure projects that had in turn helped local tourism businesses develop. And another idea that he put forward was ensuring that any public funding going to a body is designed to have an end date in the sense that it leads to sustainability of that project over the piece. And therefore, it struck me, and I'm sure many other members of the committee, that perhaps what we should be doing is having a greater look at what the national parks are doing, perhaps use them to pilot particular projects or indeed look at them in terms of learning some lessons as to the practicalities of what they're doing with success, it has to be said. And I wonder if the Minister could comment on that.
I think that's an absolutely fair comment. I mean, I know Grant Moyer, did give very interesting evidence to the committee. I do agree that the national parks sort of offer, in a sense, a sort of natural test bed to pilot ideas and approaches, and I think the parks to date have taken that approach across a number of fronts, and looking to learn more about what lessons we can learn from the experience. I think because of the interaction of the natural environment, the requirement to sort of support, sustainably supports communities in their sort of economic aspirations, but while obviously having an additional degree of protection for the environment. I think it's an interesting context in which we can have a wider evaluation of where perhaps environmental spend does interact with sort of economic growth, and to pick up on the points that were mentioned by committee members earlier. And I know the parks are sort of committed to aligning their approach to government in that respect. Obviously, like every other agency, they are looking at ways in which they can support sustainable economic growth. So by all means, I think if they can give us lessons, if you like, as to how we can learn from that in a very particular environment, but then roll those messages out nationally, I think you're quite right. They do perform an important role as a sort of test bed for policy in that respect.
And just to follow up, so I can take from that then, Minister, just in terms of our budget appraisal process, that this is something that your department will have a further think about then in terms of looking at these issues that
well, I just wonder whether, if I may, Convener, just ask Keith Connell to comment on that particular issue.
Minister, thank you. I just wanted to mention that as an example of the recognition that the government has made of the contribution of the parks, with the shovel-ready money that's been made available by the government in this financial year, an additional 1.8 million was given to the two national parks to enhance the investment that they're making in the sort of infrastructure that Grant Moyer was talking about. So I think as and when money is available, the government recognises the contribution that the park is making and is adding to the investment in them.
Certainly follow up Keith Collins' point. I believe that the investment that's been made in the Loch Lomond area has been particularly welcome from a tourism development point of view. It's a very considerable investment, and obviously underpins the economic health of that area.
Sorry, if I just make one final comment. I mean, one of the important things, I think, when we're looking at the spending of public money is the outcome. And that is a theme that's picked up throughout the Scottish Government, as far as I can see. And therefore, you know, this is a scenario where there seems to be we're getting very good value for the public pound spent, because they're very successful outcomes. And I think it was just to try to, you know, look at that in a wee bit more detail to try to see indeed how we could roll out that best practice to the wider situation.
And I think if I may, Convener, just sort of highlight that the point that Jim Hume was very fairly making early on about how we sort of view outcomes and what are we looking for in terms of the vision. We can learn a lot from the national parks about those messages about sustaining and rural communities in a way that is sustainable from an environmental perspective as well. So I think it is an important test bed for that kind of area of policy.
Thank you.
Nigel Donne.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister. I'm grateful for the opportunity to piggyback on this particular question. I'm concerned, Minister, about the need for affordable housing in many of our rural communities. There's a great deal of homelessness, much of which is hidden. Now, I'm conscious that housing is not your portfolio, so I'm not asking you to stray outside it. But it does occur to me that a lot of the things which you do have some responsibility for and influence over could be used to improve the accessibility to affordable housing, the opportunities for affordable housing, if there were a will to do so. So I guess my question is that something that you have in mind, and to what extent do you think you are able to do that, please?
Well, there are a number of, I suppose, aspects of yes, I mean, just been providing information about the National Forest Land Scheme, but we also have, as I mentioned earlier on, Land Reform Review Group, which is undertaking work at the moment as well in terms of the wider land use issues that there may be in rural communities. We can't say what they will look at, but it may well be that they look at an area such as that in terms of the availability of land for affordable housing in communities which are effectively landlocked by larger land interests. But I have taken, although it's not my portfolio, as you quite rightly identify, I'm taking a look at sort of issues such as the interaction between the climate change agenda and sort of fuel poverty, which is an issue in terms of it's not just about the availability of houses, but the impact we can have on climate change through investment in housing. Clearly, the building regulations will have an impact in that. The National Planning, MPF3, National Planning Framework, will obviously look at a number of issues, and I would hope that sort of considerations of rural housing will be included in that. So, but it's, as I say, it's not my portfolio. But I will certainly assure Mr. Dawn that I will look at wherever we can possibly support through our portfolio spend investment in housing in rural communities, recognising that many communities do face a real challenge in terms of the lack of availability of affordable housing.
Okay. You mentioned the National Forest Land Scheme, and indeed I've had a series of answers recently from the government on this. We could be making more of that asset. We've made some use of it, but the problem about getting the rules simplified in order that the Forest Land Scheme can be effective in creating more sites for affordable houses and so on in the countryside is something which I hope that you might be able to address, perhaps not just directly because it's a budgetary issue, but because it's a crying need in many areas.
Well, certainly, I hope the committee will appreciate that where we have an influence as a landowner, we are trying to work in a way which sets a benchmark for standards for other landowners, whether that would be in relation to our interaction with the biodiversity issues and protected species, but through to trying to make land available for new entrants to farming where we can, in the the Forest Commission, the National Forest Estate as well, and where we're interacting with land there. But maybe ask Bob McIntosh if he wants to add anything in terms of the National Forest Land Scheme.
I think it's a good example of the government using its own assets in order to encourage this sort of thing. I mean, the government, Scottish ministers own 10% of Scotland through the National Forest Estate, and the National Forest Land Scheme allows communities to bid to acquire sites for social housing off the open market, as it were, and it's been quite successful so far, I think, in providing sites for social housing, as well as for community purchase of woodlands for community benefit. So I take the point about the rules scheme, and we're always looking to simplify these wherever we can.
It's nice to acknowledge that the Minister is the largest landowner in Scotland.
Just discovering.
Can we move on to the regulatory authorities, SEPA and SNH? Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Minister, at our round-table discussion, we heard from SEPA and SNH regarding their involvement in the move to a more proportionate regulatory framework in Scotland. And I was actually encouraged by the NFUS statement at the round-table meeting that when they said that SEPA are working with farmers more than they have done in the past, rather than a perception previously that they were working against farmers or throwing the book at them, to coin a phrase. In your preamble, Minister, you mentioned that the consultation is currently underway on the Better Regulation Bill, which will hopefully result in better regulation rather than less regulation. As we know, regulation can both help and hinder sustainable economic growth. So I'd be curious as to know whether you'll be involved in the forthcoming better regulation legislation, and if so, what you hope it will achieve for SNH and SEPA.
Certainly, I'm happy to confirm to Mr MacDonald that not only am I involved, but we are leading on the better environmental regulation aspects of the consultation. Unfortunately, we were beaten to the drop in terms of the title of the consultation, so it's not obvious. But I reassure you that that we are very much involved, and indeed I'll be having to take a lead as lead minister on those aspects which relate to environmental regulation. As to what we're trying to achieve, I think it goes back to the heart of the issue about sustainable economic growth. However you wish to interpret that, we are trying to ensure that where possible, agencies such as SEPA, SNH, other environmental agencies are working in such a way as they are taking a more risk-based approach. So they're looking at areas in terms of projects, activities which are potentially pose the greatest threat to the environment, or indeed there has been a history of non-compliance on perhaps low-risk investments, and prioritising resources to ensure that the environment is protected by targeting it to where it's needed to be, rather than perhaps having a continuous cycle of audits of those businesses and sectors which are perhaps engaging well in terms of delivering on their responsibilities in terms of compliance. Examples that have been given, such as your garage forecourt or your dry cleaners, which obviously do emit some fumes into the atmosphere, but are generally perceived to be relatively low risk and don't require the degree perhaps of oversight that was maybe given them in the past, whereas there are major polluters or major risks to the environment that need those resources to be targeted at them to ensure that we do minimise the damage to the environment. So we're trying to move to an approach which is more reflecting the risk that's presented to the environment, and where possible to help facilitate sustainable economic growth and support those who are being responsible in their in degree of compliance they're showing to environmental objectives. I hope that helps explain where we're trying to come from a philosophy point of view, but also the involvement that I'm having with the regulations and the consultation on improving the regulations.
Yeah, indeed, it does, Minister. Thank you. We also heard at the roundtable discussion of the continuing moves to improve the planning system. What are your priorities in this area, possibly with regard to SNH and SEPA contributing to the improvements to the planning system?
It's something I'm aware of. I mean, I met with SNH last week on a sort of mini tour to see as many of the agencies as I could. And I'm aware that, that since SNH commenced its work helping to streamline the planning process in 2006 or 2007, there's been a significant reduction in the number of cases they find it necessary to lodge an objection to. A formal objection, I should say. Reducing the need for formal objections is obviously is probably the single most effective contribution they can make to speeding up the planning process where that's appropriate to do so. And I want to stress where it is appropriate to do so, because clearly there are cases where there is a need for SEPA and SNH to intervene and in some cases make a strong objection to a proposal. But where, as I say, it's part of this ethos that we're trying to move to a role where SNH and SEPA are advisors to government, advisors to local local agencies as to what the implications are of projects that come forward, and ensure that they're well informed as to the impacts, and only where it's absolutely necessary do they make a formal objection in that sense. You know, generally speaking, you know, as I say, we see SNH as an example being primarily a sort of an expert advisor to government on issues to do with the protection of the environment and natural environment, in particular the landscapes and natural environment are obviously critical to, in many respects, to, you know, how Scotland is perceived, even in sectors which don't have a direct or obvious link to the environment. You know, the perception of Scotland is important to our brand image internationally, and therefore that's something that is very important to the government to protect and enhance where we can do so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Claudia Beamish on that point.
Could I ask Minister, following on from that point, while agreeing with the discussion that's happened so far about the significance and importance of the advisory role of SEPA rather than simply coming in as a regulator. But there are obviously times when strict regulation and monitoring is needed in relation to waste regulation and where waste goes in aiming for the zero waste targets and in relation to the water quality framework and other issues. Do you have concerns about the cuts to the budget, although only, I understand, £500,000 this year, but in terms of the ability of SEPA to follow its advisory role and the regulatory role and other areas that SEPA has responsibility for?
I accept that the budget is reduced, so I'm not denying that at all, but I think the point I was making about moving to a risk-based model means that we can genuinely target the resources we do have to where the risks are really being presented. So in some respects, we're actually able to enhance the scrutiny of projects, and indeed, you know, people who have serially sort of recalcitrant types that are not taking on board the responsibilities, that we can target the resources. And the message I would want to put out there is that we will support those businesses and individuals and organisations in complying. So we want to play a role in terms of prevention rather than cure. But where we need to, we will make sure that there are resources there to police the regulations, if you like, and make sure that those individuals are aware of the responsibilities. And if need be, we will take appropriate enforcement action to ensure that those polluting activities are curtailed, where people are clearly defying their obligations and ignoring the advice we have given. But it would be far better to get to a situation where SEPA and SNH can prevent these incidents happening in the first place. And clearly that's what we would like to do. But I reassure the committee and Claudia Beamish, who's raised this issue, that I believe the risk-based approach we're taking, and indeed the consultation on charging, will reflect the prioritisation towards ensuring that those riskier activities and riskier individuals are the ones where the attention is shown.
Okay, thank you. We move on. A question from Margaret McDougall.
Thank you. And you've perhaps partly answered the question I'm going to ask. And the periods, I'll ask it anyway because there's an issue I want to raise. So are you content with the energy efficiency levels of the public bodies for which you have responsibility? And, you know, I'm thinking that you mentioned SNH and SEPA there, and perhaps, you know, they're given advice and oversee Scottish Water. So if you could perhaps give comment on that.
If I can make an apology that I've not yet, in the early stage of my appointment, been able to assess the position of all the public bodies that I have responsibility for. But in mentioning SNH, I think SNH are perhaps exemplars in this respect. I'm not suggesting that every department is doing as much as SNH yet, but I hope SNH will provide, if you like, a benchmark by which other organisations across government, not just in my own portfolio, are able to aspire to. I mean, at SNH, through the visit that I had last week, climate, they recognise clearly as an agency under this portfolio that climate change is a major threat to the very environment they wish to protect. And they've had their own greening policy since 1997, which has been measuring use of its buildings, its spend on work travel, amounts of waste it produces, and it's been reporting publicly on this since 2000. I mean, I heard last week when I went there about the work they're doing to actually assess their own carbon dioxide emissions, the fact they're moving as many meetings as possible to video conferencing where they can possibly do so to avoid their need to travel in the first place. Indeed, I offered to myself to have as many meetings as possible by video conferencing rather than requiring officials to come down, but clearly there are times when ministers across portfolios will need to meet SNH. It's important for them to visit Edinburgh on occasion as well. I think their awareness of climate change has improved dramatically in recent years, and SNH strongly welcome that. But I just want to highlight a few things which I had noted in advance of the meeting that they have done. In the last 5 years, they reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by over 30% and cut them by 13% in the last year alone. So they're doing very well against the 4% per year SNH needs to hit to meet its own and the government's own 2020 carbon targets. And they are spending wisely and indeed reaping the financial dividends from that, I think, which is a lesson for all government agencies. So against a rising global fuel cost, I suppose we've seen SNH's energy bills fall last year, which is an important message for all areas of government. And compared to where SNH would have been without the energy it saved, they themselves have would have had to spend an extra £140,000 in the last 3 years alone if they hadn't taken those measures. So that's, obviously, it's a bit like the examples we're talking about yesterday in my minister's statement about the Scottish whisky industry doing what they're doing. It's important from a business bottom line perspective, but it has an environmental benefit. In this case, it's maybe the other way around. SNH are trying to set a principal position in terms of their impact on the climate, but they're having a positive impact for public spending as well. So it's it works both ways. And I think they do show what is achievable. And I encourage anybody to visit SNH's headquarters, which is itself Great Glen House is a fantastic facility, and it shows, I think it's still one of, if not the most highly rated building in the UK. It's certainly one of the most highly rated buildings in the UK from an energy efficiency standpoint, and that's clearly helped them achieve these sort of figures.
SEPA and the Scottish Water, a lot of seepage and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, sorry. So it was just if you could comment on that, is there any work being done on that side?
I'm sure there is, as I said earlier on, I apologise to the committee that I've not yet had a chance to have discussions with both SEPA and I've had meetings with SEPA, but on other issues such as flood management, but not yet dealt with the issue of their own impact on the environment, and I will undertake to do so. I give that commitment to Margaret McDougall, and if there are examples of where they are making an impact, I will happily feed that back to the committee for your consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. Turning to Alec Ferguson, aquaculture.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we move, Minister, if we may, to the subject of aquaculture. And some of the evidence we've been given would suggest that there is very real potential for economic growth in that sector. And obviously, there's a bill just come before us and before Parliament, and we'll be paying a lot of attention to that sector in the coming months, obviously. But to what extent, assuming that potential for economic growth is real, there are obviously environmental impacts of such expansion. But to what extent is the budget in this area being prioritised?
I mean, clearly, as Mr Ferguson has identified, the Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Bill will reaffirm our commitment to sustainable growth in aquaculture and indeed sort of managing interactions between aquaculture, wild fisheries and the marine and freshwater environments. And I want to make sure that, I know the debate has been characterised as a battle, if you like, between some respects between wild fisheries interests and aquaculture, but clearly there is a substantial aspect from the ministerial point of view in protecting both environments, freshwater and marine. Significant investment is being made in a number of projects to allow the industry to go in an environmentally sustainable manner. For example, in terms of the contract research fund to enhance the Auto Depot Mod tool, and that tool is owned by SEPA, is used by the fish farm site operators to support their own applications to SEPA licences to discharge waste to the inshore environment. So there are some practical things we can do. In addition, we are investing in development of technical standards for fish farm equipment, which will reduce escape of farm fish. Finfish, I should say, and the development of the Scottish Shelf Modelling tool to enable information on dispersal in the marine environment to help consider sea lice dispersal. So these are things which we can do through research to inform the sector, and where the sector does its own research and very substantial investment in research, it is too. But those are some practical examples where we can add to the information that's available to help both those who are having to regulate fish farming activity, but also the fish farm community themselves to understand what their impacts are and to inform the planning process. I just want to highlight, I mean, as a practical example, I mean, I visited last week Loch Eilert site of Marine Harvest, where they're building a recirculation facility. A very impressive facility it is too. On the on the face of things, a major capital project in a very pristine rural environment would, you know, perhaps present concerns to some, and I appreciate that. But I was impressed by what they're doing. Again, from a business point of view, they were doing this primarily for a business objective, to reduce their water abstraction, recirculate the water in the facility, extract toxins and gases from the water, to reduce the potential for sea lice to get into their site, which is producing smolts for their wider estate. And in terms of the outputs to the environment, they are capturing all the sludge, potentially using that as an agricultural fertiliser or potentially using an anaerobic digester. So there's some practical examples of where we can support, hopefully, and advise the industry of what they can do to clean up these kind of activities. And I was impressed that was being done, perhaps without too much intervention by government in this case. They've done it of their own volition because it's an important thing to do to reduce their energy consumption and to reduce their impact on the environment. But primarily from a business reason, it saves them a lot of money too. So I think that is an example where they're growing because they're growing that facility to expand their production, but they're doing it in a way which hopefully minimises whatever potential environmental risk there was. And no doubt CEPA will have been closely involved in that throughout the planning process. So we can help through the planning process, both in a practical sense, informing the aquaculture industry, but also by the measures that they are themselves taking too.
May I follow up, Convener, briefly? Thank you. I'm grateful to you for that, Minister. Indeed, we have a number of visits planned as a committee in relation to the bill, which we will hopefully see some of the excellent examples you've spoken about, and I'm sure we'll cover a lot more of that. But could I just ask you briefly about, I know in the 2010 Marine Scotland Act there is a stated aim to increase shellfish output by 100%, I think was the aim targeted in the bill. I must confess to a slight constituency interest here because I believe that the banks of the Solway have great potential in helping to achieve that target. And that sector of aquaculture possibly has slightly less environmental difficulties to overcome if it's to achieve that target. And I just wonder if that is taken into account, whether the government still holds that aim and to what extent that's taken into account in the current budget.
If I may come back to the committee on that particular issue in terms of the Solway. I'm not familiar exactly what the implications would be there, but certainly the Aquaculture and Fisheries Bill does have a number of measures in it, excuse me, in relation to the shellfish sector. It's not purely about aquaculture, it includes measures for sea fisheries too, so it's maybe been characterised in the public discourse mainly about aquaculture, but there are specific measures in there which hopefully will support, in the context of shellfish production, again, the sustainable economic growth of that sector. But I'm happy to undertake to come back to Mr Ferguson on the specifics of the impact on Solway and provide that information to the convener.
My apologies, it's not specifically about the Solway, although
but
I obviously have a great interest in that, but there is a general issue
I'm happy
around all of Scotland's coast, I think, in that sector of aquaculture.
Only agree.
But anything the Minister cares to come back with, I'd be very much welcome.
Absolutely. Well, I think at that point, Claudia Beamish wanted a little final point.
Minister, I just have a concern which has been highlighted to me by a number of organisations about how the aquaculture bill moving forward will fit in relation to environmental concerns and in a strategic sense, in view of the fact that as my understanding is that the National Marine Plan has been delayed, possibly for good reason, and also that the marine protected areas are having to be identified simultaneously, and so how that will fit with the actual growth, which is quite exponential in my own view, in terms of actual the aquaculture industry.
Well, certainly. You're quite right to identify there's very ambitious targets for growth in the agriculture sector, so it is a substantial. I think trying to see if agriculture can go up to 210,000 tonnes. I think from it's currently hovering around 140, 150,000 tonnes. I may be incorrect, and apologies to the convener if I'm not precise enough on that figure. But yes, it's a substantial point. It's a substantial growth in the sector that we're seeking. On the MPAs, I hope that we will be coming forward relatively soon with information on that. So if I may park that issue for the moment rather than preempt it. But I understand the point that Claudia Beamish is making about the need to ensure that government does coordinate these different aspects of policy which are running concurrently to ensure that agriculture and the risks to the marine environment are managed. But I would reassure Claudia Beamish that the whole focus of what we're doing through the Agriculture and Fisheries Bill is precisely to do that, to try and ensure that there is a better, more robust regulatory environment for the sustainable growth of that agriculture sector, because we think it has an important role to play, particularly in remote rural communities, to sustaining employment and capturing economic value for those communities. But I can assure you that we will be doing it in a way that does not damage the environment. Now, I would put that message to the agriculture sector that this is not us singling them out. It's actually hopefully going to facilitate giving the confidence to the wider community that growing agriculture can be done in a way that is consistent with maintaining the very pristine environment which they use to market the product overseas. And I saw that for myself when Chinese officials from the biggest food producing company in China were visiting Loch Islet while I happened to be there. And the importance they put on Scotland's pristine environment and actually attracting them to buy produce from Scotland, which gave them the perception. It's an example of the ecosystem services that Bob McIntosh was referring to earlier. It's an indirect benefit in this case that the quality of Scottish produce is perceived to be higher because of the environment from which it comes.
I think the members will be able to interrogate the subject and the Minister when we deal with the bill. And in terms of getting to the detail of that, we'll have much more in the way of ammunition by that stage to fire about. So thank you very much, everybody, for that. I hope that that's covered a range of things which shows how much rural affairs, environment and climate change has to cover in the budget. And I thank members for their questions, and I thank the Minister and his officials for detailed answers, and hope that we are able to review these from the point of view of our report and the budget. So thank you very much for being here, and if you'll excuse us, we're going to press on with the agenda that's still in public, which is agenda item 3, and it's petition PE 1396. The third item today is consideration of this petition calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to investigate and prevent the overbreeding of Staffordshire Bull Terrier dogs. The petition was raised by Ian Robb on behalf of Help for Abandoned Animals, brackets Arbroath, and I refer members to the paper. Graham Day.
As I had a degree of involvement in this petition when it was initially presented to Parliament, I should declare that interest. And although subject to the agreement of the committee, I would not intend to leave the room whilst it's discussed by members. I would intend not to participate in the discussion.
Thank you for that interest stated. I would invite comment from members about this petition just now, if there are any. Yes, Margaret McDougall and then Dick Lyle.
I note that the Scottish SPCA have highlighted that 75% of those seeking to take a dog in their homes would not consider Staffordshire Bull Terriers, and there is all this evidence that they are breeding and then being abandoned, and obviously people in the area where they are not keen on taking them into their home. So although I agree that we should perhaps close the petition, I think it would be useful to write to local authorities to encourage them to exercise the legislation that they currently have available to them.
Thank you very much. And Dick Lyle.
Yes, Convener, I certainly agree that the petition has had a good airing, and as far as I'm concerned, it should be now closed, and basically, as already has been stated, the legislation is already in place. I take the point that Margaret's making, right, the councils, but there are, you know, I'm sure there are other, I'm a dog owner, and I'm sure there are other people who are dog owners who could say other breeds have a situation, but basically I think we should close the petition and move on.
Thank you. Jim Hume. As others have said, and it's widely known, I think it is illegal already to abandon dogs. I'm quite happy with the closure of the petition, but in writing to others, it would be perhaps appropriate to write to Kenneth McCaskill as well, being the ultimate in charge of justice, so that he could perhaps pass that down to police, etc., and also local authorities. The Scottish Government's position is stated quite clearly, but we can inform them of the decision of this committee, and it includes writing to COSLA as been suggested. If there are no further comments just now, I take it that members would agree that, given that the work completed to date by the Public Petitions Committee, the legislation already in place in Scotland, and the clearly stated position of both the Scottish Government and COSLA, the committee may wish to consider closing the petition and notifying the petitioner of the committee's decision and write to COSLA, as Margaret McDougall has suggested. Are we, Alec Ferguson?
That to be copied, as suggested, to
the Cabinet Secretary for
yeah.
Justice, yes.
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Certainly. Happy to do that. We all agreed. If that's the case, then we should clear the public galleries and we'll have a short break before we move into private just now.